that much money, and because there are very many eligible people in those regions. Alternative to eliminate poverty is to actually act on the ultimate cause of poverty, which is low labor earnings. So there is a whole host of policies that aim to improve productivity with occupation, also access to better occupation by providing credit, training, or grants. Now, unfortunately, there is not a website that codifies how much is spent on all these policies. But many people here have worked to figure out whether these are effective or not. And the bottom line as to whether these are effective or whether we should concentrate on social protection policies depends fundamentally on the reason why people stay poor. And this is what I'm going to try and do today. I'm going to try and distinguish between two views of poverty. One view is that people fundamentally are different. And everybody has the same opportunities, but people are born with different skills, different innate traits that lead them to different standards of living. In this type of view, initial endowments do not matter, the allocation of talent is efficient, and the only thing you can do to not make people poor is to subsidize their income, to complement their income by social protection. There is the alternative view, which is a view where the access to opportunities depends by the endowment itself. In this type of world, initial endowments matter, and talent is misallocated. There is still a role for social protection and social insurance, but in this type of world, if we can bring people at a higher level of endowment with asset or skill transfers, we can actually eliminate the need for subsidizing their income. So how would you go about doing this? We will use some theory just to illustrate how responses to an exogenous shock to capital can be used to test between these two views of poverty. We will use an RCT, which we ran in Bangladesh a while ago with BRAC, to use this as a shock to capital and see how the poorest people respond to this shock and see whether the response is consistent within one view or the other. And then we will take some conclusion for the implications for the design for poverty reduction policies. Okay, this is Bangladesh. I think everybody knows Bangladesh. The study region is the north of Bangladesh. There are 20 sub-districts in there. And this is the poorest region of the country. Okay? In this poor region, we surveyed 23,000 households, and we surveyed them 4 times, in 2007, 09, 11, and 14. We have a very detailed survey that looks at every labor market activity that every household member undertakes, and as well as all the productive assets that they have. Now, as part of the targeting program, that is to identify who should receive this program, BRAC asks the community to rank every household by wealth. So we have these data on 4 wealth classes for each household we know, whether they belong to the extremely poor, the near poor, the not so poor, and let's call it the upper class, but they're still very poor. Now, if you look at what these people do, these are all women, because the program targets women exclusively. We wrote a very detailed and extremely long list of jobs that women could do in these villages. Turns out that very detailed and very long list was very useless, because women do one of 3 things. Okay, we had 99 possibilities. They chose 3. They either agriculture day laborers, they show up in the marketplace 6 o'clock in the morning, they see whether somebody needs help in the fields. Or likewise, they are occasional domestic servants, they show up and ask whether somebody needs their clothes washed. Or they do livestock rearing, and that's about it. Those 3 occupations account for 80% of the hours spent in income-generating activities by women in these villages. Now, there is a very strong correlation between occupational choice and social class. You will never see an upper-class woman doing any casual labor. To the contrary, the ultra-poor women, which are the women who are the beneficiaries of this program, hardly do any livestock rearing. They mostly do agricultural day labor and made work. So how do these jobs differ? Well, wage labor, not surprisingly, is worse on every dimension. It's uncertain, is seasonal, and pays less per hour. These are basically the original zero-hour contracts. We have rediscovered them in the US and in the UK with the gig economy, but in rural, poor economies, they've existed all along. Okay? You show up, if there is work, you work however long the employer wants you to. If there is no work, you go back home. The occupation, as I showed you, is correlated with the ownership of productive assets. And these are livestock, first and foremost, but then complementary assets as well, like rickshaws, which you can use to bring the milk or the dung to the market, sheds where the cow can stay, and so on. And asset holdings are stable through time. Okay? I'm going to show you here. This is the ultra-poor, the other poor, the middle class, and the rich. And the 1, 2, 3 stands for the 3 years of the survey, the baseline, the follow-up, and the one after that. And you see here that there's basically no movement. The ultra-poor start poor, remain poor, the other poor remain at that level, the middle class remain at that level, and the rich remain at that level. Now, if you can tell the subtle difference between the colors that I chose for this graph, which now doesn't seem such a good idea, you can also see that the height of each bar, which denotes the type of asset that they have, also remains unchanged. So the total amount of assets they have remain the same, and the composition remains the same. So these people are basically in their steady state. Unless something changes, their lives are going to be the same forevermore. Ah, that's interesting. Okay, how do we think about this theoretically? Well, what we need to do here is just to understand which assumptions we need to disentangle the two views. That is, the view that these people are poor because they have traits that make them poor, or these people are poor because they are poor, because they were born poor in the first place. And I will show you that very quickly, that in order to obtain the first view, you need to have perfect credit markets, which we already know don't exist, but decreasing returns to scale to whatever factor can be accumulated. Now, the fundamental thing is that to get the second view, that is the poverty trap view, imperfection in credit markets is not enough. Because if that's all you needed, the stock could stop here. We know that credit markets are imperfect. But that's not the case. You need both imperfect credit markets and increasing returns to scale to accumulable factors. And that's the point that the theory essentially makes. In this theory, we have a person that's born with a unit of time, and a wealth endowment E, and some talent A, J. We assume that everybody is equally good at casual wage labor, although at some point I thought of my skills of cleaning the house, and I know that that's not true, but for simplicity, let's assume that that's the case. And so let's assume that A1, that is the talent in wage labor, is the same for everybody, and people differ in A2, which is the talent and livestock rearing. Right? If there are perfect credit markets and decreasing returns to scale, these people will be in the equal opportunity view. There will be a threshold of talent, A star, such that everybody below that threshold will be better off in wage labor, and everybody above will be better off in livestock rearing. So the world will look like this. This is the function. The concave function is the production function in livestock rearing. The straight line is the wage. All the people to the left of A star will be in wage labor. All the people to the right will be in livestock rearing. The important thing about this graph is that it hides the fact that all the people to the left of K A star have A less than A star. In other words, there is no misallocation. All the people who are doing wage labor are optimally doing wage labor. You wouldn't want to shift them into livestock rearing because they wouldn't be good at it. Now, without credit markets, if you have still that production function, you still won't get a poverty trap. Why is that? Because with a concave production function, the returns to any investment are higher when capital is low. So that means that if you have just a bit of money, you can start just a bit of an activity. Maybe you can rent a cow for a couple of hours. And because you're talented at it, you'll make enough money, the next period you can rent it for a day, and then for a week. And eventually you'll be able to buy one by yourself. So as long as the F is concave, there won't be a poverty trap. However, if F is not concave, if F looks like the S-shaped production function that I've drawn in this chart, then the minimum viable scale for this livestock business will be higher. And you see it in the graph there. That, combined with imperfect credit markets, means that all the people who are born with very low endowments will not be able to borrow enough to reach the minimum scale, even though their A is larger than A star. So in this world, we'll have misallocation. Now, how do we test between these two views? Well, we have the shock, which is an asset transfer which is worth about 1 year of per capita expenditure. There is 4,000 households who all receive this transfer all at the same time. By design, they all get the same value. Okay, the package, just so you know, is a cow. And a cow is worth more or less the same everywhere. It's a small area. Okay? However, the people start with different levels of assets at baseline. And that we can use to test between the two views. How do we test that? Well, if this is the way the world works, start with somebody, a KA, and somebody, a KB, here on the axis. I don't know why this doesn't work, I can't point it. But you see the KA and the KB. They all get the same transfer. The delta is the yellow delta. Okay? Notice that the yellow delta is not enough to push A past the threshold, but it is enough to push B past the threshold. So what will happen if the world looks like this is that A will return to the low steady state, and B will go past the threshold and escape poverty. We can only test the joint hypothesis that there is a threshold and that the transfer is big enough to push somebody above and yet small enough for other people. It could be that there is a threshold, but the transfer is enormous, so everybody goes past. We wouldn't be able to detect the trap. And vice versa, if the transfer was very little, we wouldn't be able to detect the trap either. So it's a matter of being a bit lucky. And here is the preliminary evidence of our luck. This is density of assets 2 years after the transfer, 4 years, and 7 years after the transfers. And you see that there is people sliding back. So that suggests that perhaps there's something going on. So how do we assess whether there's something going on? Well, we need to find this point, right? How do we find this point? Well, we do know capital at time t, and we know capital 2 years later. And that's exactly what's on the axis, right? We have capital at time t, capital time t plus 1. So we can estimate that function, and we can see whether and when it crosses the 45-degree line. And here it is. This is in the data, the productive assets of the ultra-poor in 2011, estimated non-parametrically on baseline productive assets after the transfer. And you see that this line crosses from below at one point. That point is 2.34. The transfer is worth about 2, so it's more than the transfer itself. And it crosses from below. That's the important thing. Okay? There is a steady state farther out at about 3. Now, if you don't believe non-parametric estimation, you can try and fit a polynomial to this. Given the shape, we need at a minimum a third-order polynomial. And when we do that, we get that, which is pretty much the same number. Okay? Now, you may wonder, is this really a poverty trap? Because to identify it, we are using differences in baseline assets. And baseline assets are not exogenous. They could be correlated with other things, like talent that determines the return to capital. And if that's the case, the estimated k hat would be an average of different thresholds. Most importantly, if A were to be correlated with K at baseline, there would be no guarantee that giving a bigger transfers would bring the poorest people above the threshold as well. Okay? So the rest of the talk and the rest of the paper is devoted to ruling out the fact that this K is correlated with a baseline. And we have many tests. Let me show you the first, which is what I call a sanity check. If it is indeed the case that this K hat is an unstable equilibrium, there shouldn't be anybody around there. I mean, we know that there are in treatment because the program put them there. But if we look at control, there should be absolutely nobody there. Okay? That's how it looks. This is the distribution of assets in control villages. You see it's a bimodal distribution with a big mass at a very low level and a very big mass at a very high level, and pretty much no one around 2, 3, 4 log points. Now you might wonder, maybe there is a distribution of talent which is bimodal itself. That would give you something like that. Because we have a panel for these control households, we can estimate productivity as a solo residual. You remember your macro classes, you run income on every determinant of income, so labor, so that is hours worked, assets, human capital, and so on, and you estimate a fixed effect for each household. Those fixed effects look like this. It's pretty log normal. There is no bimodality in the distribution of estimated productivities. So this can hardly explain the bimodality that we see. We have a sorting test, which in the interest of time, I might skip. And I might return to this if you guys are interested. But then I can show you the response to the transfer. Okay? So in a world that looks like this, there are many arrows here, but what is saying here is this K star is the equilibrium. So poor people, when they're given the transfer, they would accumulate more to reach K star. And rich people, that is people who are to the left, to the right of K star, will decumulate. That is, in a world that looks like this, where the production function is concave and hence there is no poverty trap, if we plot the change in capital against baseline capital, it would look like that. That is, we would find poor people more likely to accumulate capital. Why is that? Because we're giving them a push, and these are the people who are the farther away from their steady state. So they should be accumulating more capital. To the contrary, in a world like that, we know that if you start from a very low baseline level of assets, you're going to go back. So the prediction is going to look like that. People with a low level of baseline asset, the moment they're given this transfer, they will start losing it, because the income that they can generate with it is not going to be enough to compensate for depreciation. Now, we can estimate this, right? Because we have the data on the delta, and we have the data on baseline assets. So once again, we can estimate a non-parametric function of the change in capital against baseline capital. And that's how it looks. If you, on the horizontal axis, we have productive assets in 2007 plus the transfer, and on the vertical axis, we have the change. So this looks to me a lot like this, and not much like that. If you allow for discontinuity, that's how it is. All the people below the transfer, they lose at a decreasing rate. Okay? As soon as they are above the threshold, they accumulate at a steady rate. Okay? Steady or decreasing, depending on how you interpret the thickness of those bands. So there's clearly here a threshold that determines how people respond to the transfer. What we're going to do in the rest of the paper is to try and figure out whether there are other things that jump discontinuously at this threshold. It could be, for instance, that all the people below the threshold have very low human capital, and just to the right of the threshold, the human capital shoots up, in which case that's what we'll be capturing. Before doing that, however, we have to worry about things that happen by chance. Now, things change, and there are shocks, and the shocks could be correlated with baseline transfers. So how do we do that? Well, again, we have the control group. So if the control are in steady state, which from the earlier graph that I showed you looked like they were because they weren't changing capital at all, then any change in assets that we observe must be due to shocks. So we can test whether the shocks can explain the pattern of asset accumulation and accumulation that we see in treatment. Well, there it is. The red line is treatment, and this is the distribution of changes. You see that there is a mass on the negative end, and that mass is precisely -2. Now, -2 is the value of the cow. 2 is the value of the cow. -2 means that you've lost the transfer that Brack has given you. And then there is a bigger mass at about 1 or like 0.8. And that means that after the transfer, 2 years after the transfer, you have whatever Brack gave you plus about a quarter or a third more. Okay? That's in treatment. The blue line is control. There's nothing like treatment, right? There is no way that this would have happened without the program. Notice that the mass in control is more on the negative side because this is a period of food price hikes in Bangladesh. So there was a recession, so households in control villages were more likely to lose the assets than to gain them. So if you control for at the same level of capital for the shock that households got, you still have a mass. Now the mass actually moves exactly at -2. Before it was a bit more to the left of -2, now it's exactly at -2. So once you control for the shocks, the people who lose assets in treatment lose assets which are exactly equal to the transfer that they were given. And the rest of the curves shift to the right because they accumulate over and above the fact that due to economic conditions, they should have lost something. Okay. So I think this convinces us that it cannot be due to shocks. We want to see whether it's due to other observed traits. So what I'm going to show you now is a series of figures with jumps, or therefore, rather, lack of jumps. So we know that the accumulation of capital jumps right at 2, 3, 4. I'm going to check whether other things, such as nutrition, changes discontinuously at 2, 3, 4. For nutrition, we have 2 measures. One is the per adult equivalent annual food expenditure. As you can see, there is no jump, no matter how hard you squint. And on the other graph, we have calorie intake per capita. There is no discontinuous change, which means that it's not something that at 2.34 you can afford more food discontinuously. It doesn't seem to be the case. Human capital, well, nobody has education here, so not surprisingly, years of education do not jump much. Body mass index, which could be a measure of health, doesn't change at all. These are all, if you look at the vertical axis, the variation goes between 18.2 and 18.6. So these are extremely thin people. There are stories about behavioral poverty traps. It could be that 2.34 is the magical number after which you become very patient. And before 2.34, you're very, very impatient. So this is the savings rate, which is a good proxy for patience. Doesn't seem to jump. We have a measure of the discount rate, classic things where you ask people, would you like money now or a lot more money tomorrow? Doesn't seem to jump. Risk aversion doesn't seem to jump. So what is jumping? Something must be jumping for that discontinuity. Well, let's go back to the theory. The theory tells us that there are increasing returns to scale. If there are no increasing returns to scale, we should never get the effect that we get. So we have to look for something that is related to increasing returns to scale. That something typically is a fixed factor, right? Something that cannot be divided, a fixed or indivisible factor, something that cannot be bought in tiny amounts. So we now go and look at the composition of assets. So far we've looked at assets as a whole, multiplying it by their monetary value. once we look at the composition of assets, we see that now there is a jump. Here is the jump. People who are to the right of 2, 3, 4, that is, people who manage to escape the poverty trap, have fewer chickens. To be precise, the share of chickens in their total wealth is 20% lower, discontinuously so, around the threshold. So what do they have, given that the wealth is the same? Business assets, mostly rickshaws. There is a 20% hike from 1% to 30%, sorry, from 10% to 30% of total wealth of rickshaws. This kind of makes sense because if you have a cow, the way you make money from the cow is to sell milk. If you have a rickshaw, you can bring the milk farther, or you can bring it faster to the market. Likewise, you can bring the cow dung farther and faster, and you can buy things that you need for the cow, like food, and bring it to the cow quicker. So that makes, I think, sense as a candidate for an indivisible asset. So what do we learn? Well, if we take stock, what we learn is that beneficiaries who do not start with these complementary inputs regress back to poverty despite the large transfers. Those who do go past the threshold and are set on a sustainable path out of poverty. What we haven't shown you here, but we show you in an earlier paper, is that they don't eat all the extra income that they get. Rather, they save it and they invest it. And by 7 years, many of them, well, some of them, depends, many is in the eye of the beholder, have actually managed to buy land, which is not transferred by the program, and it is one of the, well, it is the priority of the upper classes in these villages. So what do we learn from policy? Well, now, if there is a poverty threshold, there are good news and bad news. Right? The bad news is that small transfers are going to be useful to make sure that people have enough to eat, but they're not going to be useful at all in making sure that people's lives are transformed. If you're a poor wage laborer and somebody gives you a small transfer like of the size of a microloan, right, that can allow you to eat more for a bit, but you won't be able to invest enough to escape the poverty trap. That's the bad news. The good news, I believe, that if there is indeed a poverty trap, and instead of giving a small transfer year after year, you give it all in one go, then you will never need to give transfers again. Because if these people are able to work their way out of poverty once they're given a sufficiently big push, there will be much less need for transfers to support consumption. And if we look at the literature that tries to evaluate programs such as microfinance, vocational training, large assets, and cash grants, we see that by and large, if you spend a lot, the program works. But that seems to be more of a necessary rather than sufficient condition. There are many programs that are poorly implemented, they cost a lot of money, and they do nothing. Okay? That's the worst case scenario. But programs like microfinance, they've been shown to work only at the margin. That is, for people who already have a business and the business is doing reasonably well, a microfinance loan pushes them up. But for anybody else, that is, people who start without a business, there's not a single paper out there that shows that microfinance allows them to start a new business. We can put all of this in one graph. What we've done here is that we've used our estimates to plot the share of households which are pushed above the threshold as a function of the transfer value. Of course, different countries have different units, and different households have different different wealth. So we normalize everything. We normalize the transfer as the share of annual per capita consumption. Okay? The BRAC program is up there. It's about 0.88. It shouldn't be a 0.8. It's 0.88. And it brings roughly 67% of households out of poverty permanently. There is a group that were already above the threshold, which is very small, and then there is about 25% who slide back. Now, how does that compare with other transfers? These are some popular programs. The microloans in Bangladesh by BRAC come into variety. Most of them are $100 in PPP, and some are $200. You see that that by itself will only be effective for about 20% of the households, because there's only 20% of the households which are so close to that threshold that $100 would push them past. The names, the country names there are countries where a similar program was implemented, and they have different size of asset transfers. And just to illustrate the point that you can spend all you want, but if the program is not well designed, you're not going to bring anybody out of poverty, Honduras is the one in which the transfer as a share of consumption was the biggest, but they gave them, I think it was 6 chickens. So it must have cost them a lot, but it wasn't particularly effective. And the last one there is Chris Blattman evaluation of the Uganda transfers to young entrepreneurs. And again, that was an enormous transfer relative to their per capita consumption and another effective program. So the bottom line is, to the extent that there are poverty traps, there is misallocation. That is, there are people stuck in a bad occupation where they have the potential to do better. And in order for them to do better, we need to push them past this threshold. The good news being that once you push them past the threshold, they will stay there forever. They won't need, with a bit of luck and not many shocks, they won't need any more support. And I think I had 40 minutes, I was told, so that's all I have to say, and thank you.
Thanks a lot for this wonderful presentation. So why don't we turn to our audience for questions, comments? Yes, please come to the microphone because we are streaming.
Thanks. I wanted to press you a little bit on what it is that is generating the increasing returns that are so important for your story in this particular setting with cows, right? So you gave the example of rickshaws. And so if you own a rickshaw, you can bring milk to market, bring feed back, and so on. But why don't people hire their neighbor's rickshaw or a space on their neighbor's rickshaw to bring milk to market or to bring feed back? Because presumably in this environment, the guy who bought the rickshaw would like to exploit it to its fullest as well, right? For the same reasons that you have these issues with cows. So what is it really that's generating the increasing returns?
That's a very good question. We've been wondering about it for a long time. So the main answer is that you don't just need increasing returns, you also need imperfect capital markets. So assume that you have a cow, and you know that by renting a rickshaw, you could be more productive. Okay? In order to rent the rickshaw, you only have the cow. Remember, these people had nothing a baseline. In order to rent the rickshaw, you need to pay for it. In order to pay for it, you need to borrow, and you can't. You can't borrow on the face of the future income that you will earn from the rickshaw. If there were only increasing returns due to the indivisibility of the rickshaw, then you're absolutely right. I can go to my neighbor and say, look, I'm going to do a killer sale on the market if you lend me a rickshaw. Just allow me to pay in a month's time. If you can do that deal, it's basically a loan. If you can have that deal, then there can be all the indivisibilities you want. There will not be a poverty trap. What this is suggesting is that those deals are not doable. That's all.
Perhaps we should collect a couple. Yes.
I wanted to ask how you would think about this in relation to poverty, not just in the developing countries that you showed, but even in places like the United States. So there's a study from a few years ago that looks at large cash transfers, several times annual earnings, that come about through lottery winnings, that compares very large lottery winners from Powerball or the equivalent lottery, so of $150,000, to small lottery winners, $50 or $100. And it shows that basically it doesn't get anybody out of a poverty trap. And so I think the way to square that with your model is just to say that the capital markets are working fine in a place like the United States, and so that sort of somewhere you have to draw the line where there's a set of countries or contexts in which these large transfers will move people out of poverty. But the main finding in that study was that $150,000 delayed bankruptcy, but did not change its probability. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Do you want me? Okay.
Why don't we take a couple more? So, yes, please.
So going back a little to this issue of the imperfect credit markets, especially in these rural economies, is there any role that social networks are playing? I'm thinking specifically about this, borrowing one's neighbor's rickshaw or whatever else is needed to bridge this gap to. And so I just wanted to know if there was anything that had to do with the networks of people and the connections they had that could maybe substitute for these imperfect credit markets.
I had a question about the geographic location. Have you sort of checked whether isolation or location has any impact on your finding on this poverty trap? Okay, Bert?
Yeah. Hey, Oriana. You only mentioned the asset transfers, nothing about skills or the intensive support. If I remember your paper correctly, the total costs are 50-50 transfers and the support part. So can you really say that if you just gave these people asset transfers and nothing else, they would have gotten them out of a poverty trap? Or is it that it's the combination program that's doing it?
So I answer the first and the last question together because they're actually more related than they seem. The answer to the first question is that we focus here on physical assets because this is what determines the difference between good occupations and bad occupations in this particular setting. If I think of a poverty trap in a rich country, I don't think that physical assets are the key determinants for that poverty trap. I think that probably access to, to the good education is a much more likely candidate. So I don't know that whether giving, well, you told me already the answer to that if you take people in the US with a very low level of education and you give them a lot of money, they don't know what to do with it. But maybe had this chance been given to children from a very low level of education and had the money been used for education, then that would have been a very different outcome. And to be precise, here we are not arguing that everybody's in a poverty trap. What we're arguing is that there are, on average, enough people so that the average looks like there is a poverty trap. Absolutely, there will be a group of people in wage labor who are optimally there, for whom no amount of transfer or training can make a difference. Okay? Sorry. So one more thing to add, and then I have to answer to the other two questions. We focus on the physical capital because that's the one for which we can observe variation at baseline. Had we had variation in human capital, then we could have also looked at the effect of the training. But because everybody starts at such a low level of skills, the effect of the training, we assume, is the same for everybody. What we can do when so we're currently working on the estimate of a structural model that will allow us to estimate the threshold for each single individual from an estimate of the A trait for every single individual. And then we can bound the effect of the training. So we can do, kind of simulation analysis by saying maybe the training is only effective for the top guys and this exacerbates the findings or maybe dumps them down. But that's the reason why we've done what we've done so far. Markets, absolutely. This is on our list because if it is a matter of rickshaws, we should find this difference to be bigger for people who are more isolated. Informal networks, there's a lot of talk about informal networks providing insurance and credit. From the look of it, if they do, it's not enough because these people clearly don't have access to credit. And they don't have access to credit to the point that the way BRAC found out about them is that they realized that there was this large group of people, about 10% of the people in the village, who were not even trying to borrow from microfinance. So these people were so poor that they didn't have anything to do with this loan. they weren't so poor so they weren't applying because they had a good substitute. So in theory, these networks might be relevant. In this particular setting, they don't seem to be.
Other questions, Norman?
So I wonder if there are positive externalities to these transfers and an agglomeration effect, so that if you give these transfers to a large enough number of people, then you will get different effects. Your talk has been focused on what happens to the individual, but we could also think about things happening at the community level or even at the national level that would have a much larger impact. And the big transformations that we have seen in terms of people coming out of poverty have been done when these interventions have been conducted at the macro or community level.
Any other questions, comments? Yes, please.
Yes, just in terms of a number, what kind of large asset transfer are you talking about in terms of actual expenditure? And if that does happen on a large scale, what's the chances of that disrupting the market, in a sense, literally spoiling the market? And I mean, if everybody has a rickshaw and cows, is that then counterproductive? So, yeah.
Any others? Berg, another one.
So if I remember your 4-year results correctly, so these people are on average at baseline are just under $1 a day, PPP, right? Something like 93 cents or something like that. And the gains are, significant in percentage terms, but 7, 8, 10 cents a day on the order of that, right? So when we think about kind of these people escaping poverty traps, and kind of how do you reconcile that kind of like in absolute terms what looks like high percentage but low absolute terms with kind of saying that 60% of people or some whatever number you said escaped poverty and then they'll actually be better off and they won't need further support?
Others? Any other comments, questions? When we go ahead with these for now.
So, the first two are very closely related. On the GE effects, there was a reason why we surveyed 23,000 households, and that's because precisely we were very worried about these externalities. Now, in addition to survey the households, we also survey the cows. That is, we didn't ask questions to the cows, of course, but we have a census of cows. And as a share of cows in each village, the transfer of cows is very small, because although the treated are about 7% of the village population, they all get one cow. And richer people in the same villages have herds of 20, 50 cows. So the extra production of milk does not affect the price of milk. And likewise, the extra production of dung does not affect the price of dung. We test for this, and we don't find any effect in the paper that he was citing before. The other thing is that there is one market in which the ultra-poor play a fundamental role, which is the wage labor, because they were almost the only ones doing maid services. In that market, where they account for a large share of the supply, the price changes. So the wage for maids goes up. That means that there is an externality which is positive on the poorer people who remain maids, and negative for the richer households who hired the maids. Now, in the long run, how do we think about it? Because you think in the long run, these people are going to accumulate more cows, so there will be general equilibrium effects. And there we have to think about the improved allocation of talent. Because if everybody were to do the job at which they're best, inevitably some people, some richer people engaged in livestock will be kicked out of that market. But that is not to say that the negative externality, if we think that there is a misallocation of talent, the negative effect will be smaller than the positive effect, because there'll be a churning of more productive people substituting less productive people. So the net effect will be positive. Now, on the size of the effect, we can debate how close they were to the poverty line and how many of them went above it. But the important thing here is the trajectory. So although at year 2, they might have not been above the poverty line, at year 4, there was a larger share above the poverty line, at year 7, even more. So the idea is that maybe it's true that they still remain, by that measure, poor, but they are going upward. So we're going back actually now in June, and I'm sure that we'll find many of them way above the poverty line. I hope at least. The cost.
Oh, you had
asked me about the cost.
Yes.
So how much does it cost? Well, the whole program in PPP cost about $1,200, of which it was half the price of the cow, almost as much the price of training, and then admin cost, because there's a lot of support, a lot of people that go and visit these households every day, every week for the first year. In the paper, which I now realize it might have been a better idea to give you, but I can send everybody the link to it. We do a cost-benefit analysis, and the estimated IRR is about 22%, because the costs are high, but the benefits are much higher.
Other questions, comments? Mariana? Okay, well, then please join me in thanking her for this wonderful presentation.